Everyone should be able to see my screen, I think. Here we are. So, strategy and weighing. I'll be doing four main sections in my lecture today. Top half strategy, which is the first two teams in your four-team debate. So, opening government, opening opposition. Back half strategy, the other two teams. Explaining strategic implications. So, that's explaining how something, an argument or a piece of rebuttal fits into the rest of the debate and shows how and why it's important in the context of what has already been said by other speakers. And finally, weighing, which is showing how one argument or one piece of analysis is more important than another argument. So, as for top half strategy, there are two main goals that you want to have as someone from opening government or opening opposition. The main thing is making as many straightforward arguments as possible. And this is mainly quite straightforward. The most obvious arguments that usually come to mind, the ones that you think of first when you see the motion, you need to make sure that you say all of them because it doesn't matter if they're too obvious or if they're not that interesting, if they're a bit boring. They're still quite important. They're going to make a strong impact, and they're probably going to be some of the best arguments that you'll be able to bring out within the debate. And the most important thing about these kinds of straightforward arguments is that they'll last throughout the debate. So staying relevant until the end of the debate is something which these two teams are really going to struggle with. Imagine being opening government, you have three teams essentially who are going to be speaking after you, and even in opening opposition, there are at least two other teams. And so there's a high chance that you're going to be forgotten by the end of the debate. The judge maybe just doesn't have a very long memory span. And so you need to make sure that what you say and what your partner say are going to still be important by the end of the debate. The best way to do this is either to have a lot of mechanisms and layers. And what this really means is just having lots of analysis and reasons as to why your arguments are true. Because even if the opposition tries rebutting your argument, and that's the most likely reason as to why it might not stay relevant until the end of the debate because it's been rebutted by two other teams. Um, if you have lots of reasons, then even if one reason is taken down, you might still have another two that make sure that your argument is still left standing. And so by the end of the debate, the judge will still be able to credit your argument because there are reasons left which explain why the argument is true. And so making sure you have all of these backups and reasons as to why your argument is true is very important. Secondly, you need to identify the most likely characterization of the debate and justify it. So here, what I mean by characterization is the most likely world in which this debate is going to take place. To give an example here, so that it's not too abstract, if the motion was about legalizing all drugs, then uh, as a proposition, as a opening government team, it would be a mistake to characterize the debate as being that the vast majority of drug takers within this debate are going to be 70-year-olds. Because if your arguments rely on that assumption that this is a world where 70-year-olds are the main drug takers, then it's very likely that another team is going to come up in the debate which recharacterizes the debate. And then they explain to the judge, wait, it's not 70-year-olds that we should be worrying about. It's a much younger demographic. Maybe it's people in their 30s, maybe it's people in their 20s. And then they go on to make much more relevant arguments that cater to these age groups far more compared to your argument, which has now been shown to be quite irrelevant because it just didn't understand what the debate was really talking about and the types of people that were going to be affected by the motion. And so, if you're not able to figure out what this most likely characterization is, then it's quite possible that you end up making arguments which aren't actually that relevant. And then finally, you need to make arguments which address the heart of the debate. Uh, and what this means is when you're given a motion, there are going to be a lot of arguments which can theoretically be made, but not all of them are actually going to be relevant. A lot of the time, the motion is trying to address a specific problem or is trying to talk about a specific topic. And so, if you make arguments which are completely removed from those like broad themes, then it's going to be a very weak argument in the context of that specific debate. So once again, for the drugs motion of legalizing drugs, theoretically, it wouldn't be an amazing point, but theoretically, you could try saying that, oh, it's a good thing to legalize drugs because of their recreational use, and that people are able to enjoy themselves and like remove stress and be more relaxed by the usage of these drugs. And yes, you could give like four or five different reasons why that's true, and then give the impacts of that, do all the things which you should in an argument. But even then, at the end of the day, that's not going to be a very strong argument because you've forgotten what the heart of the debate really is. It's not about like recreational use of drugs bringing people happiness. The heart of the debate is things like being addicted to drugs and having to go to rehab centers, or it's the stigma around drugs, or it's about the number of people which get introduced to drugs and start taking them. Those are much closer to what the heart of the debate is. And so you need to make sure that your arguments are relevant in all of these different like kinds of ways. Finally, for the top half, you need to use POIs strategically. And what this generally means is ask and receive POIs from what we call the diagonal team. So if you consider like opening government and closing government on like once like side of the debate and then opening opposition and closing opposition on the other side, there are two diagonals. One diagonal is between opening government and closing opposition. They're like furthest apart in terms of the debate. And then the other diagonal, a shorter diagonal, is between opening opposition and closing government. And the reason why this is the case is because normally you don't actually get to engage with these teams that are on your diagonal. And this is quite a big problem. If opening government gives a speech and then closing opposition later engages with them, there's nothing they can do about it to a very large extent, right? They don't have any speaking time left, really. And so the only way in which they can try attacking this closing opposition team is through a POI. And so using them strategically is very important. Before I move on, I'll wait 5 or 10 seconds. Are there any questions? Okay. So yeah, just try making straightforward arguments and make sure they stay relevant. Now, as for the back half, of course, there's some things which you need to do similarly, but overall, there is a very different kind of strategy which you need to be following here. The biggest difference is that you need to choose the right extension. And in case you don't remember, an extension is something new that you bring to the debate, which has not been mentioned yet in your opening team's speeches. And so it's a unique contribution by your closing team. But what's most important is that your extension is not just a series of arguments in a vacuum, which don't relate to the debate which has occurred before. You need to make sure your extension is an argument which is going to win the debate. And to do that, you have to be carefully listening to all of the arguments which have been said up until now by the two opening teams. And you need to see where the gap is in the argumentation and what is needed for you to win. And so your argument should relate to those that have come before you. Most likely, it should not be something so different that it like you seem like the irrelevant one. You need to make sure your argument seems relevant and important in the context of the debate. And so, how do we present these extensions effectively? The main thing is identifying this gap um, that you might be trying to fill. So maybe there's something which your opening forgot to do. Maybe there's like a really big point which they didn't mention, or there is analysis which they forgot to provide, and so you can be the team to provide it. And similarly, uh, maybe the opposition, there's a very strong argument which they've brought up, and so you can do an extension through like rebuttal and make sure that you take down opening opposition's strongest point, for example. Uh, and then finally, you need to know both in your mind and possibly even express in your speech what the problem is within the talk path that you're trying to address. So quite often, there's a key point of clash that both sides are arguing about. A very important kind of just um, maybe a characterization of like what this world looks like, and no one can really agree on it. And so you need to address and you need to first identify well in advance that this problem exists within the top half. Then most likely you inform the judge of this as well, just so that they understand what the goal of your speech is. And then you go on to resolve this key point of clash. And if you're able to do that sufficiently, then that can be a big boost to your case as a whole. So if there's something very important which hasn't been resolved yet, and you are the ones who are able to like resolve the issue, that can really help you as a closing team. And then finally, you want to be identifying who's winning the debate so far. And so this is almost like judging the debate, but not like to such a great extent. So before you, opening government and opening opposition have finished both of their speeches. Maybe even like if you're in closing opposition, then closing government has said a speech. And so what you want to do is figure out who is the strongest team in the debate currently. Why are they the strongest team? What exactly is the reason why they're winning? Is it because there's this really strong point which everyone's forgotten to rebut? Is it because they've given multiple strands of analysis for each of their arguments? Or is it that your opening team is winning and that they've like sufficiently beaten both of the two opposition teams? So what happens is if you're able to identify who's winning and why they're winning, then you can structure your own speech around that. So if your opening is losing, then you need to know what is the mistake they made uh, and try fixing that mistake. On the other hand, if your opening is a really strong team and they've clearly won the debate already, then something you can do on a strategic basis is go for second place. So remember that this is a four-team debate, and what that means is that when you're actually told who wins and who loses, it's not just a binary process. You're actually told you came first, then someone else came second, then third, then fourth. And so, of course, most of the time you're aiming to get first. You want to like win it all. But if you know that your opening is very strong and they've almost certainly won the debate already, then there's no point trying to go for first place. So what you do is you allow your opening to take first place and you aim for second place. And what this means is you don't try weighing over your opening as much. You don't try explaining why your arguments are more important than theirs. You mainly focus on rebuttal and explaining why the opposition arguments don't stand at all. And then maybe you add some more mechanisms and impacts to make sure that you actually have some contribution to the debate as well. Because rebuttal is good and all, but you do want to have some substantive points as well. And lastly, another situation where you might have to do this is in a very shallow debate where there just aren't that many arguments to be made. And so after your opening team has already taken all of the arguments, there's not much left for you to say. And so the best strategy is to focus on rebuttal. Does that make sense? Any questions? Once again, 5 or 10 seconds. Okay, so moving on to explaining strategic implications. Sorry. So, uh, what this means is why why is your speech important and relevant compared to what other people have said? So if you've given an argument, is it just a random argument that you thought up in prep time and uh, turns out it's actually like very different to what's been said in the debate until now and is kind of irrelevant? Or is your argument something which directly clashes with the main argument of the opposition and takes down their argument by disproving their key premise? So things along those lines. And the reason why you need to make sure you explicitly state the strategic implication of an argument or a piece of rebuttal is because quite often other teams or the judge are not going to understand what you're trying to do. You cannot just assume that everyone understands your thought process. And so just because you've given the argument which you wanted to give does not mean it's going to be interpreted in the way that you want. And so other teams can accidentally or purposely misconstrue your argument to either respond to it more easily or extend on it more easily. This is basically straw manning it and is clear. And you don't want that to happen. And the best way to avoid that, and because it can be avoided, is to make sure you're very clear as to what your argument is and what your argument is trying to do. If you've stated that explicitly, then it's almost impossible for another team to try to misconstrue it. And finally, the judge, they might also not really understand what your argument is trying to do. They have a different mental image of how the debate is going and what like how your argument fits into the rest of the debate. And if that interpretation is very different to the one you want, then they're going to greatly misinterpret your argument. They're not going to understand its true impacts and its true value. And so you need to explain that. And most of the time, this comes down to saying, uh, everything that I've said in my speech disproves argument X and Y of opening opposition, and it makes it so that they no longer have their impacts A, B, and C. Things along those lines. Uh, if you just give your argument, then the judge has to figure out for themselves that, oh, this argument actually responds to the opposition and it actually takes down their impacts. But you don't want to leave that all to the judge, you want to explain it to them. And finally, what can happen if you use strategic implications properly is that you can preemptively destroy an opposition's claim. And what this looks like is I'll give it through a example. Think about the motion this house would require couples to share paid parental leave equally. And so imagine you're a proposition and you want to preemptively attack opposition. One of the key arguments which opposition is very likely to make is that if you don't have this requirement, you're giving the parents much more freedom. And very similar to yesterday's lecture, where I talked about the principle of autonomy and both the practical and principal implications of it, if you give these parents more autonomy and more freedom and more choice over what happens in their life, opposition could try saying that they're going to make a more optimal decision. And there are lots of reasons why this decision would be more optimal than a 50-50% split of parental leave, where the parent stays at home, takes care of the child instead of doing work. And these reasons might be maybe a parent wants to take care of their children more, and so why not let them stay at home more? Or maybe one of the parents is just better at taking children, or maybe one of the parents has a much higher paying salary, and so it would be financially a good idea for the family as a whole if the parent who makes more money is working while the parent who isn't making as much money leaves their job for a while so that they can take care of the child. Things along those lines. And so there are definitely reasons why maybe it would lead to a suboptimal decision if you did a 50-50 split. But on side proposition, you know that opposition is going to say this. And so you need to prove beforehand that you, if you give them this choice, it's not they're not going to think logically, or they won't make the best choice of their own accord. And the way you go about doing this is basically going along the lines of, in the status quo in the current world, women are like exponentially more likely to end up taking care of children compared to men because of a host of reasons. So this might be cultural reasons as to how things have been going for like centuries and you just follow along with that, and or it could be something more like structural, and you can explain it, such as when the parent was a child, they were most likely taken care of by their mother, and so they've attached things like nurturing and care and empathy to their maternal figure. And so what that means is that when they grow up, they end up forcing their wives or their daughters into taking up those same responsibilities. And so it's not a fair choice anymore. Women are much more likely to end up being forced into doing this than men are. And once again, another reason could be things like the gap. So if you were thinking of it from a financial perspective, in the majority of situations, because the wage gap exists, it would make sense for the man to work and like help the family make as much money as possible, while the woman stayed at home because she does not have as much earning potential. But all of these things just go to show that you don't want to leave this choice up to the parents, and that almost certainly the wife is going to be forced to take care of the children. And so removing this choice and forcing couples to share parental leave equally is the right choice if you're able to prove it. And overall, you've basically destroyed the opposition's argument. They were going to stand up and give their whole case around how giving them more choice is going to lead to like utilitarian and like practical benefits. And you've already like quite thoroughly proven that it's just not possible to achieve those benefits because of all of the stereotypes and biases that we have in our minds and in the world. So hopefully that makes sense. Because you are able to like think through the strategic implications, you can like preempt your opposition. Any questions? Okay. So then, now this is the second like part of the lecture. So everything I've talked about up until now is about strategy and how that works. Now I'd like to finish off by talking about weighing. So, what is weighing? It's mainly explaining the relative importance of arguments within the debate. So, usually this is an opposition argument, and then you talk about how your argument is more important. But oftentimes it could be your opening team's argument, and you're trying to show that your closing team should win instead of your opening team by weighing your arguments up against each other. And so, why should you use it? It's mainly just like another tool in the toolkit for responding to arguments. So you can rebut an argument and try disproving it, but maybe it's too difficult to do that, or you just can't think of the right rebuttal. And so, instead, what you do is you take the argument at its best. You say, okay, maybe it is true. Maybe the argument makes sense, and opposition gets some of these impacts, but they still don't win because if you directly compare those impacts with the ones which we provide, then you'll see that we come out stronger. And with this kind of comparison tool, you're able to explain why you win the debate. And this is especially important for the two whip speakers, government whip and opposition whip, so that you can summarize the debate, you can explain to the judge why you've won, and really look over everything that all of the teams have said, weigh up against each team individually, and explain why none of the arguments which they've brought to the debate are as important as your own. And there are a few main ways to do this. These are the what I'd like to call the weighing metrics, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are other ways and other metrics that you can use, but these are some of the main ones as to how to show that one argument is more important than another. Firstly, the number of individuals affected by an argument. So, for example, if I punch 10 people, that's a lot worse than if I punch one person. And that's just obvious, right? If you negatively affect more people, then that's a worse outcome. And similarly for benefits, right? Benefiting more people is better. Uh, so that one's relatively straightforward. Then second is the intensity of the impact. So if I were to pinch 10 people versus if I were to kill one person, then although much fewer people are being impacted, killing one person is such a great impact on that person's life. They're literally dying. That means that we probably will value that over the harm that is inflicted due to pinching 10 people. And so intensity is also a very important factor here. And quite often, this is going to be the trade off between the number of individuals and the intensity of impact. Proposition is going to be on one side, opposition is going to be on the other side, and you're going to have to try weighing up these two metrics. Thirdly, you have the importance of the stakeholder. And what this really means is it is more worthwhile to help certain people than other people. And often this might be because you want to help the poor and instead of the rich. And so if the opposition has given a wonderful argument as to how the richest people in the world are going to benefit, and then you're able to show that you help those from like lower income backgrounds, then that's a very easy way to explain why the judge should value your arguments more. And another thing here is quite often the poor, for example, are also going to be in the majority. So in a debate, this kind of goes together with the number of individuals point, where you can say not only do we have the more important stakeholders, but we have a greater number of them, and that's why our argument is more important. Uh, because just in general, you want to be helping those who are more in need than those who already have a lot to help them. Fourth is marginal utility. This is somewhat similar to the example I just gave about the stakeholder, but it essentially means that the amount of help that you can provide to someone who's well off is much reduced compared to your capacity to provide help to those who are truly in need. A clear example would be if you give $100 to Elon Musk, then that doesn't really mean much to him. He's not going to be benefited very much. On the other hand, if you give those $100 to someone who's homeless, then that could help them a lot. And so that's where the marginal utility comes in, because the help that you receive is always going to be relative to what you already have. And so helping those people who have less is going to have more practical benefits. Finally, fifth is probability. And what this looks like is if you're able to prove that your argument is more probable and is more likely to be true, and so your impacts are more likely, then even if the opposition's arguments are much more devastating, if they're very unlikely, then you can probably ignore them to a great extent. And just to end off with an example, what this might look like is maybe the motion is that the U.S. should try to like take down ISIS by either like going taking like having operations in like Pakistan or Afghanistan. And so you might be able to prove that there's a high probability that the US is able to completely take down ISIS. But then opposition tries to say that there's a chance that there might be war between these countries, that Pakistan might get angry at the US and then wage war. And that would have like absolutely devastating consequences of like the number of deaths. And although maybe their argument affects more people, affects them to a greater intensity, and things along those lines, what you can show is that it's so unlikely that a war actually occurs. And you don't just say that. You don't just say it's unlikely. You prove that it's unlikely by giving reasons, such as, oh, maybe Pakistan and like Afghanistan, maybe Pakistan has good relationships with the US and they don't want to go to war because they're allies. Or maybe Pakistan knows that it's a relatively weak country compared to the US, and so they don't want to wage a war which they know that they're going to lose. And so these are two good reasons as to why war is very unlikely to break out. And so by using that like weighing metric of probability, you can try taking down your opposition's argument. Does that all make sense? Any questions on weighing? Otherwise, that's really the end of the lecture. Yeah, sure, Vidya.
Actually, I had a question on one of the previous slides.
Yeah.
You said if the opening team is winning, then it would be really strategic if you focus on rebuilding, and you can also add mechanisms and impacts. So, adding mechanism and impact will be to the points that were set by the opening, or you have to form like new points which might not be that important, but just add mechanisms and impacts.
So you can do either of those like options. Um, if you can't think of any arguments, if you think the opening has taken all of the arguments, then it's all right to just add like reasons as to why the argument is true. But you need to make sure that the judge still values your contribution. So you should be very clear. Try phrasing it as, oh, opening government mentioned this argument, but they failed to go into any depth as to why it's actually true, and they failed to provide any of the impacts. And so we, in closing, are going to fill in these gaps to try like taking to try actually making the argument feasible. And so if you're able to like prove that you're not just repeating the opening and that you're actually adding something new and relevant, then the judge will credit you, even if it's not a new argument. And that's mainly just so that you have something that you've provided to the debate, something like argumentative and something substantive. But if you know that your opening is going to win, then mainly you want to be taking down and destroying your opposition arguments so that they have nothing left and they have no arguments to stand on. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
So yeah, basically you're aiming for second place.